Excellencies, civil society representatives, colleagues, and dear participants. My name is Therese Magnusson, and I'm the director of the Nordic Africa Institute. On behalf of NAI, PRIO, and the University of Pretoria, let me welcome you to this first roundtable discussion on the theme UN Security Council, the elected 10, and the role of civil society. Today's meeting will address the Swedish experiences with the purpose of looking back and reflecting on Sweden's engagement with civil society during its council term 2017 to 2018. We at the Nordic Africa Institute, we are a research-led public agency under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Together with African and Nordic partners, we perform high-quality research on relevant societal challenges on the African continent, and where our combined knowledge informs policies among Nordic decision makers. So the co-creation of knowledge with partners is at the very center of what we do at NAI. And on this particular project that is in focus here today, which investigates the linkages between the elected members of the Security Council and the promotion of women, peace and security agenda, we are collaborating with the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, PRIO, and the University of Pretoria. This is one out of 3 ongoing projects involving researching on the UN Security Council, and we are glad and honored to have researchers and advisors from all of those projects joining us here today. Let me now return to today's meeting and today's subject. Sweden entered the Council with a feminist foreign policy and commitment to promoting women, peace and security throughout the work of the UN Security Council. As a step to achieve this objective, Sweden built extensive and active collaboration with civil society. An elected member has not done such deep and continuous involvement with civil society previously. Hence, it is significant to reflect on the lessons learned and future opportunities for these relationships, both in Sweden and for future Security Council members. Today's roundtable is the first in a series of 2, where we hope to encourage more exchange of experiences of cooperation between the E10 states and civil society. Indeed, I would also like to add, given the focus of today, that I have a personal reflection on the opportunities that civil society offers to elected states to enrich their work on the UN Security Council. Before I joined NAI, I was previously director at the Stockholm International Water Institute, which was part of the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs consultation group with civil society organizations during its membership in the Council. Through this platform, we were able to bring together stakeholders to share experiences about how to effectively empower women in peace-building efforts related to, in my case, shared water resources, specifically in Africa, but also in the Middle East. And I know when I say how grateful our partners were for having that unique opportunity to help inform the ideas and the positions of the Swedish government from the very bottom up. Before I hand over to my colleague, Dr. Marcelstrom, I'd like to take this opportunity to especially thank Per-Axel Frilingsdorf, councillor, former co-chair in former working group on women, peace and security at the Swedish Permanent Mission to the UN 2017 to 2018, and also Clara Bachmann, advocacy advisor at Kvinna till Kvinna. Thank you both for participating and joining us here today, and specifically for providing your perspectives and experiences to the discussion. And we also, of course, need to keep in mind that civil society includes a broad spectrum of organizations, and all of them are not represented here today in the speakers list. That is why I further would like to thank the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and the Life and Peace Institute for contributing to broadening the discussion with civil society perspectives. And finally, I'd like to thank our partners PRIO and University of Pretoria for our fruitful and constructive collaboration. With that, I'd now like to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Angela Marcelstrom, Senior Researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute, who will provide an overview over today's program. And Angela will also introduce the speakers and moderate the Q&A session at the end, in which I encourage you to interact, share reflections, and pose questions. Most welcome, and over to you, Angela.
Thank you so much, Therese. It's a real pleasure and a privilege and a great opportunity to meet a diverse group of people, participants, speakers, representatives of civil society, all here to talk about how elected member states with civil society can advance women, peace, and security. And my task is pretty simple. Fortunately, I am meant to just introduce folks, help sort of shepherd the process. And I'll just begin by outlining how we want this discussion to kind of flow. So we'll begin with research reflections from Dr. Louise Olsen, and follow that with presentations from Per Axel Frielingsdorf and Clara Bachmann on the practice during Sweden's UN Security Council term. After their presentations, we will be able to begin a kind of more formal Q&A session where we will have presentations from two individuals working with civil society, other civil society organizations, Tuve Evergård from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and Jenny Svanberg from Life and Peace Institute. And they are acting as sort of formal questioners, after which we'll hear from the panelists. Each time they pose a question, the panelists will be able to respond. And then we will transition into a more general Q&A session where participants in the audience will be able to have posted their questions, and we will kind of curate these questions and put them forward to the panelists. The reason we're doing it this way is that it's exactly as Therese pointed out, it's very complicated, civil society is very complex, very diverse. And certainly when an elected member is in the UN Security Council, their time there entails engaging with various actors, various types of civil society organizations, also across country situations and conflict situations, and across the spectrum of peace and security issues and themes. So we will never be able to accommodate everybody, but what we're seeking, what we're trying to sort of foster and nurture is an inclusive, engaged discussion and dialogue that teases apart some of the wonderful lessons that have been learned, but also raises some important questions about the future. And now let me turn to introduce our first speaker. And it's really a privilege for me to introduce Dr. Louise Olsen for several reasons. One is that Louise and I have known each other for many, many years and kind of cooked up this research on elected members of the UN Security Council, sort of thought about how we would like to engage with this. So it's very rewarding to be her partner and work with her over a extensive period of time on this topic. Louise has worked on carrying out systematic research examining gender equality aspects of armed conflict and resolutions for over 2 decades. And many of you know her work, particularly with regards to the development of research on women, peace, and security. And she has also been the leader of three ongoing projects on the role of elected states, as well as the leader on a project for which we could not be here without. And that is the project that was focusing on assessing Sweden's term in the UN Security Council between 2017 and 2018. It was a study that we carried out that was actually supported by the Norwegian Foreign Ministry and continued with support from the Nordic Africa Institute. And we have been able to work with several individuals, some of whom are here today. I think Patty Chang, Torun L. Tryggestad, who is the director of the PRIO Center on Gender, Peace and Security, Ingeborg Finnbach, and Professor Peter Wallenstein from Uppsala University. And together, we've co-authored this study, which has culminated in a report, a PRIO paper on Sweden's term in the UN Security Council. So it's my privilege to hand over to you now, Louise. Please take the floor.
Thank you so much, Angela, for that very kind introduction. I'm very glad to be here today. And let me also join what was so well articulated by you and the director, that the role and function of elected member and civil society engagement and the forms and shapes that this engagement can take is definitely an area where we need more research. And one where more policy research change is central in order to move forward. So I am also very, very glad to be here. And I'm also very happy to be followed by speakers that can give concrete examples and sort of raise also critical questions of what this form of engagement can look like in practice. And also thereby identify sort of challenges and opportunities for going forward. This is really critical for continuing to develop the research. So what I will try to do, and I will now take the prerogative of being a little bit dry by providing some research reflections that I hope will give us like a basic overarching structure for our discussions. And this structure is based in the findings from the report from Sweden's term and also from the Shattering Glass project, where PRIO is very happy to work together and collaborate so closely with NI and the University of Pretoria, fantastically led by Angela Marcelstrom. So what I will also say is that I will focus on what we can call positive engagement. That is sort of the when, why, and how of elected members and civil society actors collaborate to promote WPS. And that is, of course, and that really underlines the critical points raised earlier, that recognizes, of course, that the E10 group, the elected 10 group, of states is not a cohesive group, and civil society, of course, is not one homogeneous group either. It's a very broad group representing many different kind of interests and different standpoints. And also that it's important to know that, of course, interests do not always align. So there exists a number of tensions and also quite heated, I would say, engagement that I hope that we will also get into during the webinar. Finally, I think that women, peace and security is really a very particularly fruitful area to discuss elected member civil society engagement, also for the broader research of understanding elected member situation in the council. Because women, peace and security is, of course, an area that was very much driven by particularly women's organizations' engagement, both in the creation and the progress of this agenda. And it's an area where we've seen a lot of E10s play central roles during the development, starting with Bangladesh and Namibia in 2000. So this is really makes us sort of be able to identify and learn about E10 and civil society engagement that I think is also then applicable to other areas. So I really must look forward to this discussion. Next slide, please. Let me then start by saying a few words about how we, in a sense, study elected members' influence on women, peace and security in the council. So first of all, what is then the Security Council? Well, it's the highest decision-making arena internationally, very high tempo, very high workload, very harsh and often outright frosty and hostile climate. So it's a very difficult and costly arena for an elected state to maneuver. And what does the council then produce? Well, two outcomes are, of course, resolutions and statements. And that might not, when you hear the public debate, seem like very impressive at the first glance. In addition, these outcomes are produced through negotiations. So here it's important to remember, of course, that an elected member is 1 out of 10. In addition, there are, of course, the known P5s, those that hold the veto and has been there for a very long time. So each member, but particularly elected members, will have very limited impact on each issue and problem discussed in the council. And many of these are, of course, stuck in power struggles. But if a state manages to suggest and get all to agree to concrete and action-oriented language in a resolution, then that can have critical effects in the lives of people in conflict areas or on the personnel that the UN deploys around the world. So it's critical to remember that there's always someone on the receiving end of the Council. And if we scrutinize that even more in-depth from a WPS perspective, that also means that the content of the decision is key for understanding how it affects the lives of women in conflict areas. And we know that WPS came out, the first resolution 1325 came out of the fact that the Council did not explicitly or systematically consider women's agency for peace or their security, nor the impact of war on women prior to 2000. So how can an E10 then promote WPS today, and how does civil society engagement play into those efforts? Next slide, please. So in order to answer that, let us start with a question of what an E10 elected member can seek to achieve during its short term in the Council. Well, this is quite complex, but we can simplify, I think, to say that it can strive to have three different kinds of effects. It can strive to affect the normative WPS framework that sets them the mandate for how the Council works. It can affect the processes through which the Council operates, that is how it makes its decisions. Or it can try to increase the chance of having a direct impact in the countries on the Council's agenda to improve the situation of women in conflict areas. So if we start with the first, affecting the normative framework, I think this is something that we often think about when we talk about how E10 seek to promote WPS. So an E10 can here try to affect the framework in several ways. It can try to increase the visibility and understanding of women, peace and security. I think we are sometimes a little bit fooled in the sense that we treat this as those of us that work on it treat this as something that is quite simple to understand. But of course, we all know that it's very, very complex and contains a wide range of different kinds of issues and different kinds of efforts, including preventing war as such. So working on WPS and raising visibility can, for example, be to raise awareness of overlooked aspects or to change the terminology so that we move away from oversimplified understandings, or that we formulate ourselves in a way that makes it problematic to get to the problem moving forward. For example, that we move from using the word victim to survivor, example, by sort of getting also the agency perspective into aspects. For example, more concretely, they can mean working with the area formula meetings or an open debate to highlight gaps in the framework. And here, engagement with civil society can involve sort of exchanging information and ideas, collaborating on identifying briefers, sort of provide this with more knowledge and understanding of how to move forward. And E10 can also try to really add to the framework itself by championing the adoption of new resolutions. And the ones you see mentioned here are the ones that were adopted under the presidencies of an elected members. And of course, again, the civil society was absolutely critical for much of the content and how this was sort of pushed towards the Security Council. Recently, however, we see arguments that the Women, Peace and Security framework is not quite developed and that it should move towards implementation. This is a position forwarded by many civil society members. There's a risk, also argued that there's a risk of reversing the development if we try to adopt more resolutions. So this leads us to a second area where E10 can seek to have an effect, that is to affect the processes under which the Council makes its decisions, so they can become better at actually recognizing women, peace and security through its regular work. So it can seek, in a sense, to modify the Security Council working methods. To give you an example, the informal expert group on women, peace and security was created after the 15th year anniversary of 1325 to improve the information on WPS to the Security Council. Spain was central for its inception, and Sweden played a key role in developing this by being a co-chair during its term. And I'm sure that Per-Axel will tell us much more about that important forum. We also see a growing practice of inviting civil society briefers to council debates. So this can be used to give women's organization from conflict area a direct voice to speak to the council directly. There's also been effort to modify sort of how the Security Council set up field visits so that it also meets with women's organizations and get a better understanding of sort of what are the critical issues raised in a particular context. So here we can, of course, see direct engagement between elected members and civil society in order to identify briefers, to set up programs, and to fill the content of the work with something that is meaningful and relevant. Third and finally, an E10 can then seek to have a direct impact to improve the chance, at least, of having a positive impact in a conflict-affected country directly by integrating the WPS in core decisions. So, for example, it can mean promoting new criteria and sanctions. So Sweden promoted special listing criteria for sexual violence in several UN sanction regimes. It can also, E10 can also work to support integration of the WPS in resolutions and statements. And here, of course, the E10 civil society engagement can be used to identify central areas where there is a need for stronger formulations or revision of existing formulations to really address what the problems is in Mali, in Libya, to make it more concrete, because that requires really a very good understanding and detailed information. It also often quite involved creating political pressure in order to move forward, where also engagement is central. So depending then on what an E10 tries to achieve, civil society and E10 engagement can look quite different, but often always feel sort of critical roles. Next slide, please. Let me therefore sum up and end by sort of where the where, the why, and the how of civil society engagement, just as an overview. So where does it take place? Well, just as Angela very clearly outlined, it can take place in New York, where we have NGOs and think tanks that operate in the New York context with a very strong focus on the council directly, with the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security is probably one of the most well-known. Conflict, it can also take place in a conflict-affected country on the council's agenda. So many elected members engage with women's organizations or other civil society organizations in the conflict area, often through its embassies during its term. It can also take place nationally, where the civil society can engage with the state sort of in the national context. So I know that Clara from Kvinna till Kvinna will give us really good examples of what that looked like. I know also that there was a reference group created, just like Therese mentioned, in Sweden, that involved a broad range of civil society actors that was also critical for the dialogue. And in Norway, I'm now part of a dialogue forum that brings together researchers and the Ministry for Foreign Affairs on a similar way that is also critical for discussing different aspects. So why do they then engage? Well, it can be then to obtain new ideas and knowledge, critical in the formulation of the early framework. But today it's often used when a state prepares for going into the council in order to identify central gaps that it can address. And civil society is often also part of training on women, peace and security for incoming members. Another can be to improve information. Information is power, most definitely in the Security Council, and the council processes also moves very quickly. So an elected member needs to obtain information from civil society, and there's also a need for civil society to obtain information from an elected member in order to understand where the dynamics in the council is going in order to lobby for change, but also provide useful input. The third field can be to raise legitimacy or political pressure. We know that the council has legitimacy issues overall, but an elected member is elected by the General Assembly. So many take this as involving a responsibility to consult and to forward views from a range of different actors in order to provide and improve legitimacy of individual decisions in the council. And civil society here, often having a very broad global network with different perspectives and different views, can really be a very good partner in sort of developing what kind of legitimacy could look like, but also building up pressure in order to move forward. And finally, of course, to create joint understandings. There's a continuous dialogue on how to move forward on WPS, where the E10 and civil society play a very critical role in order to move forward. How do they then engage? Well, there exists, of course, a range. So let me just mention a few. You can call it an activist information pressure kind of exchange format. So elected members can, as we said, capitalize on and be dependent on civil society creating pressure for change. This can also take very practical forms. So for example, the NGO Working Group for Women, Peace and Security created the monthly action plan where it publishes its demands on the Security Council in different country contexts for each month. And this came about in part due to a dialogue that the NGO Working Group had with Switzerland when it was in the council last time, as they were looking for better information on women, peace and security in order to move forward. This also, in a sense, creates an accountability mechanism that also can be used by E10s to gain momentum. There's a need to have grounded legitimate knowledge. So there's a need to move from generic language on WPS to more concrete knowledge. And women's organizations from conflict areas often provide information and arguments that are perceived to be both grounded in actual problems and legitimate in the negotiations in a way that perhaps is impossible for an E10 to produce itself. There are also practical forms of collaboration. So there are practical ways to promote WPS in the sense of identifying briefers, and also civil society can be reliant on funding in order to be able to continue their work on WPS. Finally, E10s and civil society can collaborate by providing each other with mutual platform for exchange. So an E10 can assist in creating a platform to speak for the civil society to speak and communicate with the Security Council, the briefing, area forum, and the meetings, field visit, and so on. And civil society also provide an external platform for elected members to discuss critical questions in a more open and sort of be part of a broader debate that can be more critical, but also provide new ideas in a way that could be central then for the E10's continued work. So next slide, please. So as I've outlined, these are some of the basic points that we can identify in research moving forward. But I really now look forward to hearing more about the processes and how this can be better understood and what the mechanisms can be, which I think is really critical for the research going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. Thank you for this. That was really a great summary and an introduction to some of the key questions and strategies, and also the different sort of outcomes that are possible on WPS with regards to an E10's and engagement in WPS in the Council. I want to now turn to the session on the practice during Sweden's UN Security Council term and what we learned during that period. And the two key speakers here are our practitioners. Per-Axel Freilingsdorf, who, as Therese introduced him earlier, is with the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and also was the key lead on WPS for the Swedish permanent representation to the United Nations during the Swedish term in the Council. I'm also really thrilled that he's with us because I'm a big fan of scholar diplomats, and he is one such, having written on Dag Hammarskjöld's political role as UN Secretary General. And the other practitioner, I would like to introduce both government and civil society at the same time, is Clara Bachmann, who will share her insights also today. And for those participants here in the audience who are not Swedish speaking, you know the organization that she's the advocacy advisor for. It's Kvinna till Kvinna, which in English means woman to woman. And it's an organization that has worked for over 25 years on women's rights and has hundreds of partners around the world. And was also a recipient of the Right Livelihood Award in 2002, which is also known as the Alternative Nobel Prize. So I'm very happy to welcome both Per-Axel and Clara, and I will turn over now to Per-Axel. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Angela. It's a great pleasure to join you today, and also Clara and many other friends I saw in the list of participants that I also met when I worked at the Swedish Permanent Mission in New York. So I wanted to talk a bit today about our practical experience, mainly from the New York perspective, in particular working with civil society on implementing the WPS agenda as an elected member of the Security Council. And I think for us, civil society played a really important role already before we became a member of the Council, when we were in the planning phase. As some of you may recall, Sweden started with being the president of the Council in January 2017, and normally the presidency month is kind of when elected members try to do the very most of their time on the council presenting resolutions and such things. So I think there were quite strong expectations, not least from many countries, that since we had a feminist foreign policy and we had very clearly made WPS our top priority during our time on the council, that we would present a resolution or some kind of the Security Council document already in January of 2017. But actually, after all our discussions and consultations with civil society, our analysis landed very much in, and I think Louise pointed a bit to this as well in her introductory remarks, that the frameworks and the resolutions are already in place. So what we really need is more implementation of the WPS agenda. And I think for us, this was really key to our whole 2 years on the council. So we decided very early on
also when it comes to traveling, a lot of our both colleagues and partners had problems even getting a visa in time to actually participate in New York events, especially during the Trump presidency, of course, because visas were a huge problem then. But in general, all of that are, you know, concrete problems that must be acknowledged at least. And I think that's just realizing what kind of a uphill battle it is for a lot of our partners in conflict-affected countries, as they are so resource scarce and marginalized. So they really have to fight every day to get their voices heard, and that needs to be kept in mind in kind of any engagement with society overall. I think my time is probably already up, so I'll stop there, but look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clara. I'm also mindful of time, and I also suspect that everybody has questions or comments, including Louise and Per-Axel, and that you also have some comments too. So let me turn over now to the next stage in our discussions and welcome Tuve Evergård, who will present her comment from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom.
So thank you. I want to just begin to say a big thank you to Unite for inviting us to join this important discussion that we're having today. Just to start off with some brief information about WILP, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which is an international feminist peace organization, the first women peace organization in the world, also the founder of Consequently, that is in the panel today. We have national sections spread out all over the world, and I'm representing the Swedish section. But I'm also working as a regional coordinator to support the work of WILP's 19 national sections in the African region. One of WILP's international programs that many of you might know about is the WPS program called Peace Women, that is well known for its monitoring of the Security Council. And I could also mention that same as Kvinnas, WILP Sweden is also part of the WPS working group here in Sweden. During Sweden's membership, WILP Sweden and Peace Women presented a number of recommendations to the Swedish MFA. And one of our primary recommendations was that Sweden should highlight disarmament and non-proliferation as an important part of conflict prevention and women's security. This connection is recognized in the Swedish Action Plan for Feminist Foreign Policy, but was, from my understanding, not picked up in the work on the Security Council, which leads me to my first question, which is mainly directed to Per-Axel, I believe. These more informal meetings taking place with MFA and CSOs in Stockholm, did that input and recommendation reach the delegation in New York? And was that input taken into account in the same way as the more official briefing meetings that took place with CSOs in New York? Then I just have two short questions regarding the dilemma of digitalization. I would say the majority of WILP's members that are based in fragile conflict or post-conflict settings don't have access to high-speed internet or reliable electricity. And the rapid digitalization that we all know have some many positive effects also creates a huge obstacle to women's participation and civil society's opportunity to give input to important decision-making processes. So during Sweden's membership, did you have any digital consultations with civil society? And if yes, was it ever discussed or highlighted how this might have excluded many voices, or rather was more an inclusive way of bringing in civil society input? And during COVID, as you all know, there's been a big backlash when it comes to civic space. And part of this are the many meetings that have been canceled or postponed. But now when the world is opening up, it has become more evident that even though meetings are being held again, civil society continues to be excluded due to the fact that restrictions differentiate on people and people, for example, diplomats and women's rights activists. So is this something that any of you are worried about? And if yes, do you have any strategies in preventing or managing this to enable women's rights activists' participation and input in the near future? So that was 3 questions and some reflections. please let me know if I should repeat any of the questions. So the first one, I guess, was directed more to Per-Axel, but it'd be interesting to hear reflections and thoughts from the rest of the panelists as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuve. What I would like to suggest is, because I'm also aware that the other participants are also most welcome to pose a question in the Q&A box in the meantime. And that way we can begin kind of curating questions and be prepared for a more open, a wider discussion with a wider kind of reflection. So I just want to be mindful of that and remind everybody that they should please pose their questions. And I then will say, let me suggest, if possible, that we actually take it in this order where Louise, Per-Axel, and then Clara can respond to your questions, Tuve, and that they can address them in the best way that they think will work. They may not address all of the questions, but however they think that they can be most sort of insightful. So is that all right with you? Louise, would you be able to respond, or am I putting you a bit on the spot? No?
A little bit on the spot, yes. So maybe just to underline what I think is a really critical point of sort of how, under circumstances like the COVID crisis, where the working methods of the Security Council changes and you get this shift in routines, how important it is, just like you were saying, Tove, that the participation aspects and WP aspects are then also integrated into those kind of new routines. And also with the changes of digitalization, what are the risks of exclusion and also opportunities for a broader spectrum that might not be able to travel but might be able to participate through other forums. So how do we actually think around that so we don't get caught in the traps, but actually rather see the opportunities going forward? And I think particularly it is interesting when you read the Security Council and how sort of taken aback they were by the fact that they could even not make decisions in the beginning because they couldn't meet physically and they didn't have working routines in terms of how to form decisions even under those kinds of circumstances. So I can only agree with you that these are really critical aspects to also include in the WPS research going forward. Just one line.
Thank you so much. Per-Axel?
Thank you very much. So I think on the first question, yes, that was relayed to us in New York. We always received a verbatim report of the meetings with the civil society consultation group in Stockholm. And then when it comes to digital meetings, that's a no. I don't recall we had any digital meetings. And I think in general at the time, this was before COVID, of course, there was a sense in the council, especially among some of the permanent members, that they wanted to avoid everything that was done on video. So it's very, very rare to see video or digital briefings in the council at that time. I think, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Clara?
Yeah, I don't know if I have so much of an answer. I just, I agree with Tove on her sort of analysis. And I think it's interesting to think about, just as Per-Axel said, I think I remember that too, that when we proposed sort of partners of ours to be able to brief the council, and if that would only be able to do via video, it was to say that was a big no-no, just also in terms of impact, because that briefer's message would not come across as well. And that seems like a very long time ago now, that like this group of people that would just say no to video meetings, and we are in a very new reality now, which also shows that things can happen that, you know, create a new status quo or a new reality that we have to adapt to. But I think it's also interesting that Tove mentioned, like, how did recommendations that we put into Sweden, in Stockholm, or, you know, anywhere else, did they actually go somewhere? And I think that points back a little bit to what I was saying before on follow-up, that I think that we provided a lot of recommendations, and all of these venues were of course great that they were created, all of this reference group and working groups and all of that, but not so, I mean, I don't remember that we ever kind of got really a clear message back of like, yes, and we used this there, and your recommendation here, we put it forward there. And obviously that could have just been of time pressure issues, but then it's just also hard for us to know if we did our job in providing those like really timely and tailored recommendations when you don't get that feedback. So I can just agree with Tove.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. And now I want to let Jenny Svanberg in from the Life and Peace Institute. And Jenny, you have also some comment and questions. And again, I want to be a little bit of a pest and buzz in the ears of all the other participants who are listening to please put your questions into the Q&A box. Thanks. Please go ahead, Jenny.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you to Nai for organizing this roundtable, and thanks to Louise and Per-Axel and Clara for your very interesting presentations. So I'm Senior Advisor at the Life and Peace Institute, which is an international peace building organization. We work a lot with civil society. And we were not engaged really at Sweden's UN Security Council term, and we don't specifically focus only on women, peace and security. So my reflections come from a bit of the outside, but we think it's a very relevant analysis to local to global engagement and how member states should think of connecting with CSOs to gather insights and give them space to influence decision making. And during the last years, Life and Peace Institute have developed our Sweden program, where we, for example, have engaged as a member of the Swedish delegation to the high-level political forum on sustainable development, with a focus from our side on Goal 16. And we have also engaged more on global policy, where LPI's Inclusive Peace in Practice initiative seeks to test out and innovate in engaging global policy spaces, and especially in terms of connecting local actors to global decision-making with the long-term aim of supporting more effective policy responses. And one area we have been targeting there is the peace-building architecture of the UN. So we have seen that decision-making is often removed from those most directly impacted and living with conflict, resulting in ineffective policies and responses, not addressing the issues at hand. So I think we think it's really important to kind of bringing local and global actors together in new and innovative ways, and really understand, trying to enhance the understanding. So we are trying to test out new ways of collaborating and shifting who and where the decisions are made. And we aim to see new voices seen as experts and sitting on the decision-making table, and also where the tables should be. So we agree with Clara, and also kind of that we have noticed that member states do not always engage CSOs in an equal and participatory manner, with the very kind of last minute asking for responses. And we also agree on the barriers to meaningful engagement, where power issues, which Clara mentioned, are major. And the process can be very intimidating for CSOs, even though they are actually the experts of the issues at hand. We also agree on the tokenistic engagement, and often the kind of 5-minute interventions can be seen as nice stories and maybe not seen as hardcore evidence. And also we agree on the challenges of kind of spaces hard to access due to location and visas, etc. And also kind of the jargon can sometimes be difficult for those who are not kind of in the context. So we think that kind of there are possibilities for improvement with changing locations of meetings, better organization, and better preparing for voice and working with those who are speaking, but also preparing better for listening with policymakers and being prepared to hear local actors' intervention. So coming to my questions, meaningful participation for us, we see it's vital that we kind of close the loop when CSOs are consulted. So going back to them, and too often we forget that, and then local actors feel used and that they were only consulted in an extractive process. So my question is Per-Axel, you stated that it was CSOs were very engaged from the beginning, but were there also kind of a loop where this closed and kind of results came back to civil society? Louise, in the paper, I think I read that you said that findings from the Women, Peace and Security process could also be relevant for other policy areas. So I'm thinking, what are the lessons we can learn, for example, for youth, peace and security, which is another area going forward, and maybe also Clara, if you have some suggestions there. And a final question for anyone, if kind of from your experience, what are the best means, spaces, models for convening and conveners to foster collaboration among CSOs and governments, and especially when operating at different levels and in different spaces? That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Very good. Now I think I'm going to, I'm not protecting Per-Axel because he's from government. But I was going in reverse order this time and going to suggest that Clara takes the first question and Per-Axel's next, and then Louise comes last. Is that all right with the three of you?
Sure, it's fine by me at least. I think it's a really interesting question to raise the sort of synergies that can be created with the youth, peace and security agenda, or at least maybe some of the kids' diseases that the women, peace and security agenda had in the beginning that can be skipped now with youth, peace and security. And I just speaking on this topic of like civil society engagement, I think that the youth organizations have a really big challenge in mainstreaming their recommendations as relevant to all areas of work and not only sort of youth issues that I think that the women's movement have struggled with forever, that the women's movement's recommendations are important for all of society and not only women's issues for women. And I can't say that I know how to do that, but I think that youth organizations can link up with women's organizations and we can share experience and learnings on that, because I think it's really key that young people are seen as actors and not only as these, as we said, tokens that come in and give this cute speech. And I think we have youth activists that have shown that it's possible to really stand your ground and not only be a cute story. Maybe one Swedish girl in particular. So I think there is definitely opportunities there. So I don't have the answers. I just agree that conversation should continue.
Yes, Per-Axel. Thanks, Clara. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So when it comes to results coming back to civil society, and I apologize if there is some drilling heard in the background. When I listened to you, I think we could, it sounds like we could definitely have done that better. As I recall, we organized briefings where we also briefed sort of on what we thought that we had achieved during our term on the council, but it's of course a bit in the nature of things that it's difficult also to pinpoint because of this input we achieved this. I mean, often it's a lot of different things, but listening to you now, I think that's something that could definitely have been done better, because I think for us, we were of course very much interested in getting lots of information from civil society, and not always perhaps thinking of relaying back how was this useful, how did we use this later on. Then I also wanted to just address, since Clara already in her presentation and many others also spoken of how it easily becomes that you have a token female briefer or similar, and I think this is really an issue where I think also civil society can help E10 members, because I hope that Sweden didn't do that, but I have seen other examples of council members where it really is, you know, it's coming from the right place. They are big supporters of the agenda, but what they do ends up being more of a gimmick or something rather than actually something meaningful. And there, I think also it's very good if you can have that kind of trust also with civil society, that as an elected member, you can also test your ideas and then also be prepared to hear that it's a bad idea or perhaps not thought through or similar, and that you also consider not just that you want to have a woman as a briefer, but why do you want her? Like I can just take one example we had where we had a very powerful briefer who had been, she was a young woman, but she had been a child soldier with the FARC in Colombia, and so she had actually been also unfortunately someone who had been very active in the conflict. I mean, she'd been carrying a weapon herself and actually been a combatant, and I think that was quite powerful because it was not what the council or the people listening were expecting from a briefer at all, just as an example. And then also what we tried to do during our presidency was to actually have 50% of all the briefers were female, which was the first time, and I think still the only time in the council. And that was not by adding lots of women briefers, but by actually asking the secretariat to provide us with briefers who came from the UN system, who are women. And that's also something that's changed quite a lot in the last few years under Secretary General Guterres, that there now are enough women in high positions in the UN, that's not such an issue. I think 5 or 10 years ago, that would have been impossible because you wouldn't have found enough women on high positions in the UN system. So hopefully that will not be an exception as it was when we did it back in 2018. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Per-Axel. Please let Louise take the floor.
Yeah, again, really excellent and very, very tricky questions. I think if we knew that, we would be even further along in the research. I think it's important just to underline what Clara said, that I mean WPS and also definitely, I mean in Tove's point in terms of WPS went before in breaking new grounds. It really opened up the core concepts of what is security, what's the responsibility of the international community, of the Security Council, and what should that be like if we then think about what kind of objectives and that we should try to reach. I think those times where it has been successful is exactly where, just like Clara said, sort of when you manage to actually get into the main processes and avoid being sidetracked and marginalized, so that you actually start to get to the main decisions. We know all the way back to Beijing, you know, mainstreaming didn't come out of the thin air. It came out of the fact that otherwise women were sort of sidetracked from the core. There was the main discussions on security and development, and then there were women's discussions on peace and development. And what the women, of course, wanted was to change the core concept and to reach the core objectives. So I think for the women, peace and security, I think many of the ways of thinking you can learn very much from the forms of institutionalized ways of collaborating, and then also evaluate and assess what were then the ways that led towards the core of power, and what was it that took us away from the core of power. So I think that's probably the academic answer. There could be sort of many ways to assess, but I definitely think there are the way of thinking. I think WPS was very new on identifying forms for that could really be used today.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Louise. I have a million things I would like to say, but I would like first to recognize Torun Tryggesahl, who has provided a really good question, which actually fits really nicely with the things that have already been raised, the comments that have been raised, and kind of extends the question much more sort of further and is a little bit concrete. She asks, on the issue of short time frames and the extremely work-intensive nature of being an E10, although countries like Sweden and Norway are generally very positive to civil society collaboration, it can be challenging to diplomats to include civil society, even if they want to. They simply do not have time to reach out. This leaves other CSOs with the most resources and good networks in a privileged position. Did Sweden try to do something about this? And she says, I think someone mentioned quarterly CSO meetings, but were there any other channels for communicating input and ideas? And this is a concrete question, like a point of contact to whom CSOs could send emails, etc. I'm not sure who wants to answer that question. Can we ask Per-Axel to answer that question?
Yes, I'm happy to answer that. Thank you. A very good question, and I think a big issue, not just for the WPS agenda. And I think in terms of how we worked, we certainly had more contact with some of the organizations. I'm talking from my own perspective now, being based in New York, with some of the organizations who are in New York, who are dedicated to working on the council, who knows all the jargon, all the language, and who also has, as you put it, the resources. So I think what we tried to do to go beyond that was, well, also to have a very open door policy. So whenever someone contacted us who was traveling through New York, we'd meet with them. And then it would be not necessarily me as the WPS expert, but we'd try to have then the expert for, if it was someone from Afghanistan, then the expert responsible for Afghanistan would meet with them, and probably me as well. But and then of course our embassies in the field played a very big role in that, because we rely very much on them, on kind of engaging with all actors in the field, including those who may not have kind of resources to make themselves visible. And on your question, was there sort of an email? No, we didn't have a specific email, but we have all of our, as in all embassies and missions of Sweden, we have all the personnel are listed with their personal emails online. So we very often received input that way from civil society organizations. And that would then be given, if it wasn't already directed to the right person, it would be circulated within the mission. So it would arrive to the right person. Thank you.
Muted. Thank you so much, Per-Axel. Because we are running out of time, I'm not really able to offer the floor to all the panelists to say a few words. I just want to say thank you, particularly to Jenny Spanberg and to Tove Ivergård for their really excellent questions, and also bringing in some more sort of nuance about civil society and the various roles, the different roles and perspectives that they had. But I would really like to give Louise, Per-Axel, and Clara one opportunity to say one short word in closing, and then I will close us out. Perhaps what we could do is we could start, this time I would start with Louise.
Oh, thank you. Then let me just say that a warm thank you for excellent comments, Per-Axel, Clara, Jenny and Tove, because I think the points, just like Angela said, that you raised are critical for research. I'm just going to leave it there. Thank you, and leave the word to you.
Thank you, Per-Axel.
Thank you very much, and thank you for organizing this. I think for me and my colleagues at the ministry, I know some of them are watching as well, this has been very useful, because I think it's very good to have the luxury in a way to come back and reflect on what we did in 2017, 2018, and what we can do, and hopefully will also be relevant for both civil society and other elected members. Thank you very much.
Clara, you have the last word
Thank
in this
you.
group.
Yeah. No, just thank you to all the other speakers. And I think that Sweden did so many good things, and I think continuing this work in being open also to criticism and lessons learned, and all of this is part of that work. So we're a critical friend to the Swedish government, and thank you for a really interesting discussion today.
Thank you so much to all three of you. There were so many very important questions, I mean, issues that came up, and I had questions, even though I've listened to this discussion and been involved in it before, and obviously know a bit about the research. But I want to just say that I'm really appreciative also of the critical questions and the critical feedback and the back and forth from everybody, and that there was this kind of triangular dialogue between research, civil society, and government, even though I keep stressing that PRIO is not representing the government voice officially. We want to make it possible for there to be further dialogues and exchanges. I want to clarify a little something about the project Shattering Glass, because I think you've all heard us mention it several times. And it's this project that NI and PRIO and the University of Pretoria have together, which is looking at African elected members in the council. And our attempt really, and why we call it Shattering Glass, is because we think that what elected member states can do, and what's been sort of illustrated with Sweden's story and engagement, and even the relationship now that we see between Ireland, Mexico, and Kenya, for example, and the way in which the E10 can be quite relevant in moving things forward when they collaborate together, is that they're able to sort of hopefully break through the glass ceiling that the Security Council can sometimes, or has created, by not properly or not meaningfully always engaging processes that include women in the work of making, keeping, and building peace. But quite literally, that glass ceiling cannot be shattered without the insight and evidence and knowledge and even constructive criticism that comes from civil society. So that's why we've decided to call it Shattering Glass, and why we've decided to do these two webinars to kind of put this in the spotlight. And I'm very happy that so much of the discussion today also touched on the role of civil society briefers, and that Clara brought that up and critiqued it. Our next webinar, which I hope that everybody will participate in and attend and register, is on November 9th. It's at the same time. And there we are going to turn to really focus on the past, the present, and the future of civil society briefing. And we'll focus on African inputs from civil society briefers to kind of exchange about the practical application of this practice, what this practice is of briefing. I'm also happy that we'll have Pablo Castillo Diaz from UN Women participating in that webinar, and Sitembele Mbete, who is a professor at the University of Pretoria, who will also be participating in that webinar. And they are both very active in the project. Sitembele is a co-participant researcher, and Pablo Castillo Diaz is an advisor, as well as civil society briefers. And with that, I want to just thank all of you for taking time out and for listening and for participating. I would like to thank the speakers, all of them, for their contributions. Our NI colleagues for their hard work in making this event possible, particularly Jim Jomanainen, who I always massacre his last name, who is a research assistant in this project, and I will not massacre his last name next time. And also I'm very grateful that Therese was able to be with us today and really listen in and be active and welcome everybody. So thank you all, and I wish you all a very good evening, a good night, or a good day, wherever you are in the world. And we hope to see you on the 9th. Thank you, and until then, goodbye.